The wind tearing through the public corral of Oakhaven carried the bitter sting of January, but it was the silence of the townspeople that cut Nora Hayes to the bone. She stood in the center of the frozen mud, clutching a bundle of faded wool to her chest. Inside the bundle, her 6-month-old son Leo whimpered, his tiny cries snatched away by the howling gale. Nora's fingers, pale and trembling, were tightly woven into the heavy brown wool of her late husband's oversized coat. It was the only thing of value she had left. "You have 5 minutes to get off my property, Nora," Thomas Hayes said. He stood on the dry, elevated planks of the livery porch, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat, his face flushed not from the cold, but from the heat of his own manufactured self-righteousness. "It was Henry's land," Nora managed to say, her voice cracking, her teeth chattering so hard it hurt her jaw. "It is my son's land," Thomas sneered, pulling a folded piece of heavy paper from his vest. He threw it. The wind caught it, tossing it into the dirty snow at Nora's boots. "It was Henry's debt, and since my brother lacked the spine to pay it before he caught the fever, the bank transferred the deed to me. You're a squatter, Nora, a thief in a dead man's house." Nora dropped to one knee, the cold seeping instantly through her worn skirt. With one hand supporting her baby's head, she reached out with shaking, bruised fingers and picked up the heavy paper. The signature at the bottom, Henry's signature, was wrong. The H was too sharp, the loop of the Y too shallow. She had watched her husband write his name 100 times by lantern light. This was a forgery. A brutal, calculated lie meant to strip a widow and an infant of their only shelter. She looked up at the circle of faces surrounding the corral. The blacksmith, the baker's wife, the preacher. They all looked away. Thomas held the purse strings of half the town. No one was going to speak for a penniless widow when winter was already threatening to starve them all. "Please," Nora whispered, though the word tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated begging. She had sworn she never would. But Leo shivered against her collarbone, his skin terrifyingly cold. "Just let us stay in the barn, just until the blizzard passes. If we walk out there now, he will die." "Then you should have thought of that before you tried to steal from your own blood," Thomas said coldly, turning his back. "Sheriff's out of town. You're on your own. Walk." Nora knelt there in the snow for 3 long breaths. The despair threatened to swallow her whole, a dark, suffocating wave. But as Leo let out a weak, rattling cough, the despair shattered, replaced by a jagged, feral instinct. She was a mother. She would not let her son die in the mud for the amusement of cowards. She shoved the forged paper deep into the pocket of the oversized coat. She stood up, her spine locking into a rigid, defiant line. She did not look at Thomas again. She did not look at the townspeople. Gathering the heavy wool tighter around her child, Nora turned her back on the only civilization for 50 miles and walked toward the northern trail, the trail that led up into the jagged, snow-choked teeth of the Blackwood Ridge. She did not see the man watching her from the shadows of the abandoned livery stable. Elias Boone had not come to town for justice. He had come for salt and ammunition, things a man needed to survive alone in a high mountain trapping shed. He stood completely still, merging with the dark timber, his massive frame hidden beneath a weathered, floor-length canvas duster. His dark brown eyes, shadowed by a heavy brow and the brim of a pulled-down hat, tracked Nora's slow, agonizing progress. He watched the way her left sleeve, torn at the shoulder, let the biting wind tee at her skin. He saw the violent trembling in her shoulders. He heard the faint, desperate rattle of the baby's wooden toy as she walked. The town of Oakhaven called Elias a murderer. They called him a ghost, a wild brute who had lost his mind in the high country. They feared him, and he let them, because fear kept them away from his mountain. He had learned a long time ago that getting involved in the affairs of civilized men only led to graves being dug. He had a silver sheriff's star buried deep in his pocket to prove it. He watched the townspeople disperse, hurrying back to their warm hearths, leaving a woman and a baby to freeze. The sheer, banal cruelty of it made a muscle jump in his square jaw. Elias stepped out of the shadows. The snow crunched heavily under his thick leather boots. He didn't look at the men on the porch. He didn't speak. He simply adjusted the collar of his coat, turned his broad shoulders toward the howling northern trail, and followed the fading tracks in the snow. He didn't know if he was walking toward a rescue or a burial, but he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen too much death, that he was not going to let them die alone. The trail up Blackwood Ridge was not a road. It was a scar cut into the side of the mountain, steep and unforgiving. Within an hour, the weak winter sun had vanished behind a suffocating wall of grey clouds. The snow did not fall so much as it drove sideways, a barrage of tiny, blinding needles that stung Nora's face and froze her eyelashes together. Every step was a battle against gravity and the deepening drifts. Nora's lungs burned with the icy air, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The tear in the left sleeve of her woolen coat had opened further, and the wind bit into her bare flesh with the ferocity of a wild dog. She could no longer feel her fingers, which were locked in a death grip around the bundle holding Leo. The baby had stopped crying. That terrified her more than the howling wind, more than the darkness creeping into the edges of her vision. A crying baby was fighting. A silent baby was fading. She pressed her face against the gap in the wool, her frozen lips brushing his shockingly cold cheek. "Stay awake, Leo," she whispered, her voice immediately swallowed by the storm. "Please, sweetheart, stay with me." The faint, rhythmic clack of his small wooden rattle, tucked inside the blankets, was the only sound tying her to reality. The cold was insidious. It stopped hurting after a while, replacing the sharp agony with a heavy, dragging lethargy. The snow began to look soft. The urge to just sit down, just for a moment, to close her eyes and rest, became a physical weight pulling at her spine. Her boot caught on a jagged root buried beneath the powder. Nora had no strength left to correct her balance. She pitched forward, twisting violently in midair to ensure she landed on her side, taking the brunt of the impact to shield the baby. She hit the frozen earth hard. The breath was knocked from her lungs in a white cloud. She lay there in the snow, the wind instantly burying her edges, turning her into just another drift on the mountain. She tried to push herself up, her right hand slipping on the ice. Her muscles refused to obey. She was entirely, utterly spent. Through the roaring wind, she heard the heavy crunch of boots. Panic, sharp and visceral, pierced through her exhaustion. Thomas, or his men. They had come to make sure she was truly gone, to take the forged deed from her pocket so no one could ever question their claim. Instinctively, Nora curled tighter around Leo, one numb hand dropping to the pocket of the oversized coat, her frail body preparing for a blow. But the blow never came. Instead, the brutal, cutting wind suddenly stopped hitting her face. Nora forced her heavy eyelids open. A shadow blotted out the storm. It was a man, massive and broad, crouching beside her in the deep snow. He was not Thomas. He wore a heavy, floor-length canvas duster that whipped wildly in the gale, and a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered, all sharp planes and hard angles, the face of a man who belonged to the unforgiving wilderness. It was Elias Boone. She recognized him from the rumors in town, the ghost of Blackwood Ridge, the man they said had a heart made of winter stone. Nora flinched, a pathetic, broken movement, expecting cruelty because cruelty was all she had known today. Elias saw the flinch. His dark, weary eyes tracked from her bruised, frost-bitten face down to the bundle clutched to her chest. He saw the tear in her sleeve. He saw the desperate, animal terror in her gaze. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He didn't ask what she was doing out here. The mountain did not care for conversation, and neither did he. Slowly, Deliberately, keeping his hands where she could see them, Elias reached for the top button of his canvas duster. He unfastened it, then the next, shrugging off the massive, wind-breaking coat. Beneath it, he wore a thick wool shirt, completely inadequate for standing still in a blizzard, but he did not hesitate. He leaned forward and draped the heavy, body-warmed canvas duster entirely over Nora and the baby. The sudden, anchoring weight of the coat, carrying the heat of his large body and the scent of pine resin and wood smoke, was a shock to her freezing system. It was the first act of mercy she had experienced since her husband died. Nora stared up at him, her lips parting, trying to form a word of thanks or a question, but her throat was locked. "Hold him," Elias said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, little more than a vibration beneath the roar of the wind. Before she could process the command, Elias slid his thick, leather-gloved arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other firmly behind her back. With a smooth, terrifyingly easy surge of strength, he stood up, lifting Nora and her baby out of the snowdrift as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Nora gasped, instinctively clutching his solid shoulder. He was a wall of muscle and bone, radiating a quiet, absolute stability. Against the chaotic fury of the blizzard, his chest was an immovable shelter. He did not look down at her. He simply turned his face into the biting wind and began to walk. Each of his steps was measured and certain, driving through the knee-deep snow with the relentless power of a plow. He used his own body as a shield, angling his broad shoulders to break the worst of the wind before it could reach the canvas coat wrapped around her. For the first time all day, Nora stopped fighting. She pressed her face against the rough wool of his shirt, closing her eyes. She was still terrified, still freezing, but as she listened to the steady, calm beating of this stranger's heart beneath her ear, a tiny, fragile thought broke through the darkness of her despair. He is not going to let us fall. They moved through the whiteout for what felt like an eternity, the world reduced to the sound of his breathing and the crunch of snow. Finally, the wind's pitch changed, broken by the shape of a structure. Through the slit in the canvas, Nora saw the dark timber logs of an isolated trapping shed, tucked defensively against the side of a stone ravine. A small stone chimney stood at its end. Elias didn't bother knocking off the snow. He kicked the heavy wooden door open with one boot, carrying her over the threshold and into the dark. The transition from the lethal, biting cold of the mountain to the heavy, resin-scented warmth of the cabin was not gentle. It felt like walking through a wall of fire. Nora woke with a sharp, involuntary gasp, her body jerking as the blood began to violently force its way back into her numb extremities. Her fingers and toes burned with 1,000 agonizing needles. For a terrifying, disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. She was lying on her back, resting on something thick and coarse, a heavy bearskin rug. The massive, wind-battered canvas duster was still tucked securely around her shoulders. The wind was still screaming, a muffled, furious roar against thick timber walls, but it could no longer reach her. Then, her arms felt the emptiness. Panic, colder and sharper than the blizzard outside, seized her chest. She bolted upright, the canvas coat slipping from her shoulders, exposing the torn left sleeve of her woolen dress to the cool air of the room. "Leo!" she gasped, her voice a raw, cracked rasp. "Quiet," a low, gravelly voice commanded. 9. It was not a threat, but a sound of absolute authority that commanded the room. Nora whipped her head toward the sound. The cabin was a single, modest room, dominated by a large stone hearth, where a healthy fire cracked and spit, throwing dancing orange shadows against the dark, adze-hewn logs. Sitting on a low wooden stool near the hearth was Elias Boone. In the flickering firelight, the man the town called a ghost looked less like a phantom and more like a mountain himself. He had stripped off his wet leather gloves. His large, calloused hands, scarred and weathered by years of brutal survival, were currently occupied with a task so delicate it made Nora's breath catch in her throat. Leo was resting in the crook of Elias's massive left arm, wrapped snugly in a dry, gray woolen blanket. The baby was not crying. He was awake, his tiny eyes fixed on the fire. In his right hand, Elias held a battered tin cup that had been warmed near the coals. He had taken a clean strip of white linen, dipped it into the warm goat's milk inside the cup, and was carefully pressing it to Leo's lips. Nora froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched, entirely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene. This was the brute of Blackwood Ridge, the man who supposedly lived like a feral animal, who possessed a stare that made the saloon drunks lower their eyes and cross the street. Yet his thick fingers moved with agonizing care, letting the infant suckle the warm milk from the cloth, withdrawing it only to dip it again. As Leo drank, his tiny hands shifted beneath the blanket, and the faint, familiar clack of his wooden rattle echoed softly in the quiet cabin. Elias did not look at Nora, though she knew he was acutely aware she was awake. His attention remained entirely on the child. "He was too cold to cry," Elias said quietly, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to settle the frantic energy in the room. Frost was settling on his lips, needed warmth from the inside out. Nora pushed herself up on her elbows, her muscles screaming in protest. You saved him." Elias paused, dipping the linen strip one last time before setting the tin cup on a flat stone near the fire. "I brought him inside. The fire did the rest." He stood up. The sheer size of him in the enclosed space was intimidating, his broad shoulders blocking out the firelight as he turned toward her. But his movements were slow, deliberate, telegraphing his intentions so as not to startle her. He walked the short distance to the bearskin rug and knelt, holding the bundled infant out to her. Nora scrambled forward, her bruised, trembling hands reaching out. As she took Leo, her fingers brushed against Elias's. His skin was rough as tree bark, radiating a profound, steady heat. She pulled Leo to her chest, burying her face in the warm, milk-scented wool of his blanket. He was brief. Hinge easily now, the terrifying chill gone from his small cheeks. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled over Nora's lashes, tracking through the dirt and soot on her face. She wept silently, burying the sound in her son's blankets. She wept for the humiliation in the town square, for the terror of the frozen trail, and for the overwhelming, crushing relief of this single, unexpected act of mercy. Elias did not offer awkward platitudes. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply turned his back, giving her the privacy her dignity required, and walked back to the hearth. He picked up an iron poker and shifted a burning log, sending a shower of bright sparks up the chimney. "Town let you walk out into a whiteout?" Elias said to the fire, the disgust evident in the heavy timbre of his voice. Nora wiped her face with the back of her wrist, shivering slightly as the adrenaline began to leave her system. She looked down at her torn sleeve, pulling the oversized brown coat tighter around herself. "Thomas Hayes told them to, my husband's brother. Hayes owns the bank, owns the sheriff. He owns everything now," Nora whispered bitterly. "Even the roof over my son's head." Elias set the poker down. He reached for a blackened iron kettle resting on a hook above the flames and poured steaming water into a clean tea in mug. He dropped a pinch of dried pine needles and something that smelled heavily of earthy roots into the water, letting it steep. He brought the mug over to her, setting it gently on the floorboards near her knee. His dark eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the violent purple bruising around her knuckles, a testament to how hard she had gripped her child through the storm.
"Thank you, John."
"Drink," Elias said softly. "It'll chase the chill out of your blood." Nora looked up at him. For the first time, she truly looked at his face. Beneath the unkempt hair and the hardened, solitary exterior, His eyes held no cruelty, no expectation, and no demand. There was only a quiet, watchful endurance. She picked up the mug with shaking hands, the heat seeping wonderfully into her palms. "Why did you follow us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper over the sound of the wind. Elias looked away, staring toward the heavy wooden door that was barred against the violent world outside. He stood there for a long moment, a solitary man who had spent years choosing the harshness of the mountain over the company of his own kind. "Because a world that lets a mother and child freeze in the mud," Elias said slowly, his jaw tight, "is a world that needs a reminder of what a door is for." He walked to the far corner of the cabin, leaving her by the fire. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from a chest and tossed it toward the rug. "Sleep, Mrs. H. Eyes. The storm isn't getting through those walls, and neither is anyone else." Time in the cabin was measured not by clocks, but by the steady consumption of firewood and the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping infant. Outside, the blizzard raged with unbroken fury, a white leviathan thrashing against the timber walls. Inside, the fire held the darkness at bay. Nora awoke slowly, the deep, bone-weary ache in her muscles a harsh reminder of how close she had come to dying on the trail. She was still lying on the bearskin rug, the heavy woolen blanket Elias had given her pulled tightly up to her chin. Leo was asleep against her chest, warm and content, his small fists curled into the fabric of her dress. She shifted, trying to ease the stiffness in her right shoulder. As she moved, the oversized brown coat of her late husband slid off her side. Something heavy and damp slipped from the deep pocket and dropped onto the wooden floorboards with a soft thwack. Elias, who had been sitting quietly near the stove, whittling a piece of pine, stopped. He didn't startle. He simply turned his large head, his dark eyes locking onto the folded piece of paper lying on the floor. It was the deed, the forged debt Thomas Hayes had thrown into the freezing mud. Nora gasped, her hand darting out to snatch it back, a knee-jerk reaction born of terror and powerlessness. But her bruised fingers were stiff, and she was too slow. Elias stood up. He stepped head over to the rug, his massive frame casting a long shadow, and picked up the paper. "Please," Nora said, her voice tight, a sudden spike of anxiety twisting her stomach. "Give it back." Elias did not hand it back immediately. He stood near the firelight, carefully unfolding the damp, crumpled document. He didn't look at it with the illiterate confusion of a wild mountain hermit. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the neat lines of ink, moving down to the signature at the bottom. He stood perfectly still, reading the document with an intensity that made the air in the cabin feel heavy. He ran a rough, calloused thumb over the ink of Henry's supposed signature. "Your husband," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Was he a left-handed man? Nora blinked, utterly taken aback by the question. "Yes," she whispered, pulling Leo a fraction closer. "How could you know that?" Elias didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the paper, tilting it slightly toward the fire. The slant of the letters. A left-handed man pushes the quill differently. The ink pools on the back half of the curves. He tapped the bottom of the page. But this signature, the H and the Y, the ink is dragged from the right. The man who signed this hesitated. He was trying to draw a name, not write his own. Nora stared at him, the anxiety in her chest giving way to a profound, bewildered shock. The man standing before her in a weathered canvas duster, the brute the town of Oakhaven whispered about like a ghost story, was analyzing penmanship with the cold, clinical precision of a seasoned lawman. "It's a forgery," Nora said, her voice trembling, though not from the cold this time. "Thomas did it. He knew Henry was too sick to manage the accounts. He waited until Henry was in the ground, then he brought this to the sheriff. But the sheriff is Thomas's friend. He wouldn't even look at it." Elias slowly folded the paper along its original creases. He knelt and extended his large hand, offering it back to her. "A town without a true lawman is just a cage run by wolves," Elias said quietly. Nora took the paper, her fingers brushing the rough, scarred leather of his skin. She tucked it safely back into her pocket, her eyes never leaving his face. "Who are you?" she asked softly. They say terrible things about you down there." "Let them," Elias replied, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He turned his back to her and walked over to the small iron stove. Words don't keep the snow out. He lifted the lid of a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven sitting on the coals. A rich, savory smell instantly filled the small cabin, making Nora's stomach twist violently. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in 2 days. Thomas had locked the pantry before she was even officially evicted. Elias took a clean wooden bowl and ladled a generous portion of thick venison and root stew into it. He broke off a large chunk of dense, dark bread and set it on the rim. He brought the bowl to her, placing it carefully on the floorboards near her free hand. "Eat," he commanded gently. Nora looked at the steaming food, then up at him. She watched as he went back to the stove, took a much smaller, battered tin bowl, and scooped barely half a ladle of broth and a few scraps of meat for himself. He didn't take any bread. "You didn't take enough," Nora said, her protective instincts flaring even through her overwhelming hunger. "You carried us through a blizzard. You need to keep your strength." Elias sat down heavily on his wooden stool, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at her, his dark eyes catching the firelight. For the first time since she had seen him in the shadows of the livery stable, the hard, unyielding lines of his face softened just a fraction. "I have survived on less," he said quietly. "You are feeding the boy. The boy needs you strong. Eat your stew, Mrs. Hayes." Nora looked down at the bowl. The steam rose, carrying the promise of life and endurance. Her throat tightened. She had expected to be dead by nightfall. Instead, she was sitting by a warm fire, her baby sleeping peacefully, while a terrifying stranger gave her his own food and saw the truth no one else would look at. She picked up the wooden spoon with a trembling hand. She took the first bite, the hot, rich broth coating her throat, and for the first time since her husband died, Nora felt the rigid, terrified knot in her chest begin to loosen. "Nora," she said softly, staring into the fire. Elias paused, his tin bowl halfway to his mouth. "My name is Nora," she repeated, looking up at him, offering the only thing she had left to give, her trust. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He gave a single, slow nod. "Elias," he said, and the silence that settled between them after that was no longer the silence of two strangers trapped in a storm, but the quiet, foundational beginning of a sanctuary. The fragile peace of the cabin lasted only until the deep hours of the night. The wind had lost its screaming fury, settling into a low, mournful howl that signaled a drop in temperature so severe the timber walls groaned under the shrinking cold. Nora lay on the bearskin rug, exhausted but unable to sleep deeply. Her maternal instincts, sharpened by trauma and fear, kept her suspended in a state of hyper-awareness. The silence is what woke her fully. Leo had been shifting earlier, his small breaths a steady, comforting rhythm. Now, the breathing was a rapid, shallow wheeze. The wooden rattle lay discarded by his side, entirely still. Nora sat up, pushing the heavy woolen blanket away. She pressed the back of her bruised hand against Leo's forehead and felt a sickening jolt of pure terror. He was burning up. The dry, radiating heat of a severe fever had taken him. His small face flushed a dangerous, unnatural red in the firelight. "No, no, no," Nora whispered, panic clawing up her throat. She pulled him to her chest, but he was unnervingly limp, his eyes closed tight. A shadow moved across the room. Elias was instantly awake. He didn't ask what was wrong. His eyes, accustomed to reading the grim realities of survival, assessed the situation in a fraction of a second. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt beside the rug. He pulled off his leather glove and pressed 2 calloused fingers to the infant's neck. His heavy jaw tightened. "The cold pushed deep," Elias said, his voice low but laced with a sudden, urgent tension. "Now the blood is fighting back too hard. Mountain fever. It'll fill his lungs if we don't break it before dawn. Nora looked up at him, her eyes wide, entirely dependent on this terrifying stranger's knowledge. What do we do? I don't have medicine. I don't have anything. Elias was already moving. He strode to the corner and grabbed his heavy canvas duster, throwing it over his broad shoulders. There's a root, red willow. It grows thick beneath the ice shelf at the bend of the creek, half a mile down the ridge. Steeped in boiling water, it'll draw the heat out of his chest. "You're going back out there?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. The thought of being alone in the dark, with Leo burning in her arms, terrified her almost as much as the blizzard had. Elias paused at the door. He reached to his belt, unsheathed a heavy, bone-handled hunting knife, and set it gently on the wooden table. "Drop the iron bar across the door once I step out," Elias instructed, his dark eyes locking onto hers, demanding her focus. "Do not open it for the wind. Do not open it for a voice you don't recognize. When I come back, I will knock 3 times, pause, and knock twice. Understand?" Nora nodded, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket. "Please come back." "I'll bring the root," he said simply. He opened the door, slipped into the freezing dark, and the heavy oak swung shut behind him. Nora rushed forward, throwing her weight against the iron bar, securing it into the heavy iron brackets. Then she retreated to the fire, holding Leo, praying to a god she hoped was still listening on this desolate mountain. Outside, the cold was an absolute physical weight. Elias pushed through the knee-deep drifts, his boots finding the hidden contours of the trail by memory alone. The storm had broken, leaving the sky a brutal, clear black, dusted with ice-sharp stars. The moonlight painted the snow in ghostly blues and silvers. He reached the frozen creek within 20 minutes. Drawing a small hand axe from his belt, he dropped to his knees and began hacking at the thick ice near the bank. The sharp thwack of steel on ice echoed dangerously loud in the still canyon, but he didn't stop until he broke through to the freezing mud beneath, tearing out a handful of the fibrous, dark red roots. He washed them quickly in the icy water, shoving them into his coat pocket. As Elias stood up, the wind shifted, blowing up from the valley below. His body went entirely still. Years of tracking men who did not want to be found had honed his senses into weapons. He didn't just smell the sharp bite of the pine. He smelled the faint, oily tang of wet horsehair and cheap tobacco. He turned his head toward the southern ridge. Through a gap in the trees, about a mile down the trail they had taken earlier, a faint, unnatural yellow light flickered. A lantern. Thomas Hayes had not been satisfied with watching Nora walk into the storm. He had sent men, land grabbers, ruthless trackers hired for their lack of conscience, to ensure the widow and the infant were dead, and more importantly, to recover the forged deed before anyone else could find her body. The clearing sky had given them a chance to follow the broken trail before the wind erased it completely. Elias's hand drifted to his pocket, his thumb brushing against the cold silver of the hidden sheriff's star. A familiar, dark anger, the kind he had buried years ago, began to thaw in his chest. He turned and sprinted back up the mountain. Inside the cabin, Nora heard the sharp, rhythmic knocks. 3. Pause. 2. She threw the bar back. Elias pushed inside, accompanied by a cloud of freezing vapor. He didn't take off his coat. He moved straight to the stove, crushing the red willow roots with the hilt of his knife and dropping them into a tin cup of boiling water. "Give it a minute to steep," Elias said, his chest heaving slightly from the climb. "Then soak the cloth and let him suck the water. Do it slowly." Nora took the cup, her hands shaking, but she saw the hard, predatory set of his jaw. "Elias, what's wrong?" Elias walked to the corner of the room. He reached behind a stack of firewood and pulled out a lever-action Winchester rifle. The metallic clack-clack of a round being chambered sounded deafening in the small room. "Your brother-in-law is a thorough man," Elias said quietly, stepping toward the window and cracking the heavy wooden shutter just an inch. "He sent his dogs, and they just found the trail to my door." The sharp, earthy scent of the red willow root filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of gun oil. Nora dipped the clean linen strip into the dark, steaming water, her hands trembling as she pressed it to Leo's cracked lips. The baby was weak, but instinct took over. He suckled a few precious drops. "Keep him drinking," Elias said. Nora looked up. Elias was a towering silhouette against the firelight, the heavy Winchester rifle held loosely, but with lethal familiarity in his right hand. The canvas duster fell to his boots, transforming him from a solitary mountain man into a dark, immovable force of nature. "You can't fight them all," Nora whispered, the terror for her child bleeding into terror for the man who had saved them. If Thomas sent them, they are armed. They kill for money, Elias." "Then they'll die for nothing," he replied, his voice devoid of anger, entirely flat and factual. He paused with his hand on the heavy iron latch of the door. "Bar it behind me. Do not open it until you hear the sequence." Before she could say another word, he was gone, swallowed by the freezing blackness. Nora rushed to the door, slamming the iron bar into place with a heavy clunk. She backed away, clutching her baby tightly, and sank down onto the bearskin rug to wait. Outside, the wind had died down to a low, creeping hiss, leaving a brittle, bone-chilling stillness over Blackwood Ridge. The moonlight illuminated the snow-choked trail in pale silvers and deep, blue-black shadows. Elias did not wait at the cabin. He knew better than to let violence happen near the walls that sheltered the child. He moved with complete silence, his massive frame navigating the deep drifts with the practiced ease of a predator. He bypassed the main trail, taking a steep, treacherous shortcut over buried roots and slick granite, heading for the Cliffside Pass. It was a narrow cut of rock a quarter-mile below the cabin, bordered by a sheer 80-foot drop into a frozen ravine on one side and a solid wall of granite on the other. It was a natural bottleneck. If Thomas's men wanted the widow, they had to walk through this lethal corridor. Elias owned himself behind an outcropping of dark stone near the top of the pass, blending perfectly into the shadows. He waited. Within 10 minutes, he heard them. The heavy, uncoordinated crunch of boots, the muttered curses, the faint, bouncing glow of a yellow lantern cutting through the darkness. There were 3 of them, wrapped in thick furs, carrying repeating rifles and heavy revolvers. "I'm telling you, she's dead," the lead tracker grunted, holding the lantern high. "Ain't no woman survived that whiteout in a torn dress. We just gotta find the snowdrift she's buried under, dig out the paper, and go back to the fire." "Tracks lead up this way," the second man argued, his breath pluming in the lantern light. "Someone dragged her. Big boots." "Don't matter who it is," the third man sneered, racking the lever of his rifle. "Mr. Hayes pays the same for 1 grave as he does for 2. They stepped into the narrowest part of the Cliffside Pass. Elias stepped out from the granite wall, entirely blocking the trail. He didn't yell. He didn't raise the Winchester to his shoulder. He simply stood there, a massive, dark obstacle against the pale snow, the rifle resting easily at his hip. "The trail is closed," Elias said, his voice echoing low and heavy off the stone walls. The 3 trackers froze. The lead man raised the lantern, trying to see the face hidden beneath the pulled-down hat, but only caught the glint of Elias's dark, unforgiving eyes. "Look here, mountain man," the leader said, masking his sudden unease with bravado. "We ain't got business with you. We're looking for a thief who stole from Thomas Hayes. Hand her over and we walk away." "The only thieves on this mountain," Elias said, his voice dropping a terrifying octave, "are the men standing in front of me. Turn around." The man in the back didn't wait. He leveled his rifle, but Elias was impossibly fast for a man his size. Elias didn't shoot. Gunfire would echo back to the cabin and terrify Nora. Instead, he swung the heavy steel barrel of the Winchester in a brutal upward arc, smashing the lantern. The glass shattered. The yellow light died instantly, plunging the pass into disorienting moonlight and shadows. Before the leader could draw his pistol, Elias stepped forward, grabbing the man's heavy fur collar with his left hand and hurling him backward. The man crashed into the granite wall with a sickening crunch of bone, sliding to the ice, unconscious. The second tracker lunged with a hunting knife, a desperate blind thrust in the dark. Elias pivoted smoothly, letting the blade slice through the empty air and catch the heavy canvas fabric of his duster's deep pocket. The canvas tore. Elias drove the brass-plated butt of his rifle hard into the man's ribs, dropping him to his knees, gasping for air. As the canvas pocket ripped, a heavy, tarnished silver object fell from it. It hit the frozen rock with a sharp, metallic clink, sliding across the ice and stopping near the boot of the third man, who was trembling, his rifle shaking in his hands. The moonlight caught the object. It was a 5-pointed silver star. The third tracker stared down at it. His eyes widened as he realized he wasn't looking at a wild mountain hermit. He was looking at a badge. "Boone," the tracker whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up at the massive silhouette. "Elias Boone. You're the hanging sheriff of Red Creek." Elias stood over him, his breathing completely even, unaffected by the violence. He didn't confirm or deny the title the territory had given him before he had been betrayed and driven into exile. He slowly reached down and picked up the tarnished silver star, his calloused thumb brushing over the old, familiar points. "Tell Thomas Hayes," Elias said, his voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of the frontier law, "that the widow Nora Hayes is under my protection. If he wants the deed, he can come up this mountain himself." The tracker dropped his rifle, grabbed his groaning companion by the collar, and began dragging him back down the trail in a blind panic, abandoning the unconscious leader. Elias stood in the freezing wind until their frantic footsteps faded completely into the valley below. He looked at the silver star in his hand, a ghost from a past he had sworn to obey. For 5 years, he had run from the law because the law had failed him. But looking at the badge now, he thought of the bruised, terrified mother sitting by his fire, and the feverish infant fighting for his next breath. He slid the badge back into his torn pocket. He turned and walked back up the mountain. When Elias reached the cabin and gave the knocking sequence, 3, pause, 2, Nora threw open the door. She was clutching Leo, but her eyes were clear. The heavy flush had left the baby's face. The willow root had broken the fever. Nora looked at Elias. She saw the torn pocket of his duster, and she saw the dull glint of the silver star resting inside it. She didn't ask a question. She simply stepped aside, allowing the man who was once feared as a murderer, but who was truly the only decent man left in the territory, back into the warmth of the hearth. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving Blackwood Ridge buried under a heavy, blinding expanse of pristine snow. The sky, stripped of its violent gray clouds, was a pale, icy blue that offered no warmth, only a glaring, silent stillness. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to a deep, steady bed of crimson coals. Nora sat on the bearskin rug, gently rocking Leo. The baby's breathing was clear and rhythmic, the terrifying rattle in his chest completely gone. The red willow root had done its work. He was alive, his small cheeks holding a natural, healthy pink. Elias. Boone stood near the small window, strapping a heavy leather gun belt over his thick wool shirt. He pulled his canvas duster on, ignoring the tear in the left pocket where the tarnished silver star rested. "We leave within the hour," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet room. "The snow is deep, but the crust will hold my horse. You and the boy will ride. I will lead." Nora looked up, clutching the oversized brown coat tightly around her shoulders. The thought of returning to Oakhaven, to the public corral where she had been thrown into the mud, made her stomach twist with cold dread. Thomas will have the sheriff waiting. He'll say I stole Henry's property. He'll try to take Leo. Elias turned from the window. The morning light caught the hard, weathered planes of his face. Thomas Hayes sent armed men up my mountain to kill a woman and a child. He forged a legal document to steal land. The sheriff in Oakhaven may belong to him, but the law of this territory does not. He walked over and stopped a few feet from her. He looked down at the sleeping infant, then at Nora's bruised, pale face. You survived the mountain, Nora. Do not let a coward in a warm room make you tremble. Nora drew in a slow, shaking breath. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the heavy, folded paper of the forged deed, determined. She looked at Elias, at the immovable, absolute certainty in his posture, and the fear in her chest fractured, replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. She nodded once. The journey down the mountain took 3 grueling hours. Elias led his massive, shaggy draft horse through the deep drifts, using his own body to break the trail. Nora sat in the saddle, wrapped in layers of wool and Elias's heavy blankets, holding Leo securely against her chest. The world was a silent, frozen cathedral of pine and stone. Elias did not speak, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, but there was no sign of the trackers. The mountain had scared them away. They didn't stop in the town square. Elias led the horse straight down the wagon road to the edge of the valley, toward the sturdy 2-story timber house that Henry Hayes had built with his own hands. The Hayes farm. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. Through the front window, the warm glow of a hearth fire pushed back the winter chill. Thomas had wasted no time. He had moved in the moment the blizzard had started, claiming his dead brother's life as his own. Elias halted the horse near the porch. He reached up, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped Nora down from the saddle. "Stay behind me," he murmured. He didn't bother tying the horse. Elias walked up the wooden steps, his heavy leather boots thudding against the planks with a deliberate, rhythmic weight that sounded like a death knell. He didn't knock. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the thick oak door squarely in the center. The iron latch shattered. The door slammed open, crashing violently against the interior wall. Inside, the parlor was suffocatingly warm, smelling of expensive cigar smoke and Henry's good whiskey. Thomas Hayes sat behind Henry's heavy oak desk, a ledger open in front of him, a crystal glass in his hand. 2 other men, town deputies who supplemented their poor wages with Thomas's bribes, were lounging by the fire. The violent crash of the door brought all 3 men to their feet. Thomas dropped his glass, the amber liquid spilling across the ledger. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding white glare of the snow behind him, was Nora. She was pale, her skirt caked in frozen mud, her left sleeve torn, holding the infant to her chest. To Thomas, she looked like a vengeful spirit conjured from the blizzard. But it was the man stepping into the room ahead of her that made the 2 deputies freeze in their tracks, their hands hovering uselessly over their holsters. Elias Boone filled the entryway. He unbuttoned the top of his torn canvas duster and swept the right side back, resting his large, calloused hand on the polished wooden grip of his heavy revolver. With his left hand, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver 5-pointed star. He tossed it onto the oak desk. It landed with a sharp, heavy clack right in front of Thomas. Elias Boone, one of the deputies whispered, the color draining from his face. The Red Creek lawman. Elias's dark, unyielding eyes locked onto Thomas. "The storm is over, Hayes," Elias said, his voice dropping into the quiet room like a physical weight. "And so is your claim to this house." Thomas Hayes stared at the tarnished badge resting on his dead brother's ledger. The arrogant sneer that had commanded the town of Oakhaven for months melted into a mask of pathetic, trembling cowardice. "You have no jurisdiction here, Boone," Thomas stammered, backing away from the desk. "You're an exile, a ghost." Elias did not move. I am the man who just broke the jaw of the tracker you hired to murder a widow and an infant in a whiteout," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The other two are running back to the flatlands. They will talk to the circuit judge to save their own necks." Nora stepped past Elias, the heavy canvas duster trailing behind her. She did not look at the deputies, who had already wisely backed away, their hands raised in silent surrender. She walked directly to the heavy oak desk and pulled the crumpled, forged deed from her pocket. She smoothed it out and laid it right beside Henry's open ledger. The difference in the signatures was glaring, undeniable proof written in black ink. "You threw my son into the snow," Nora said, her voice steady, possessing a quiet, unbreakable iron that she had forged in the brutal cold of Blackwood Ridge. "You thought because I had no husband, I had no shield. You were wrong." She turned her gaze to the two deputies. "Take him to the jailhouse, or I will let Mr. Boone handle his arrest according to the laws of the High Mountain." The deputies didn't hesitate. They grabbed Thomas by the arms, ignoring his frantic, pathetic protests, and dragged him out the shattered front door into the freezing morning. The heavy silence of the house returned, but it was no longer a suffocating silence. It was the quiet of a slate wiped clean. Elias stepped up to the desk. He picked up his tarnished silver star, his calloused thumb brushing the metal one last time before he dropped it back into his torn pocket. He turned toward the door, his massive frame blocking the blinding light of the snow. His duty was done. He had paid the debt of mercy he felt he owed the world, and now the solitary, frozen mountain was calling him back to the shadows. "Elias." He stopped, his hand resting on the splintered doorframe. He looked back over his broad shoulder. Nora was standing by the hearth, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. She had unwrapped Leo, the baby wide awake now, his small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. She was no longer the broken, terrified woman freezing in the mud. She was the rightful owner of this land, a mother who had survived the worst the frontier could throw at her. "The Mo. Unton is too cold today," Nora said softly, her dark eyes holding his without wavering. "And this house has too many empty rooms. It needs a man who knows how to keep a fire alive." Elias stood motionless in the doorway. He looked at the woman, at the child who had slept against his chest, and then at the warm hearth. Slowly, the rigid, defensive tension that had carried him through 5 years of solitary exile began to release from his shoulders. He didn't offer a flowery promise. He didn't speak of love or destiny. He simply turned around, closed the shattered door against the winter wind, and walked back to the fire. There is a profound, unshakable beauty in finding your first true sanctuary in the most unforgiving of places. In a brutal frontier world that measures a woman's worth by the men who own her, sometimes the greatest act of love is simply opening a door and refusing to walk away. It is the quiet strength of rough hands offering warmth, the silent vow of a man who stands between a mother and the storm, proving that true protection doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. When the world throws you away, the right hands will always hold you close.
I'm here. Stay here with us. Please, don't leave. It's cold outside. Stay here with us. Did you find your way back? Did you find your way back?
Yes, finally. We're safe now.